Welcome to the Red Light Exposé podcast.
We are an international grassroots survivor-led circle.
Our goal is to counter the growing acceptance of sex work ideology.
We aim to raise awareness of the harms of commercializing sex,
meaning prostitution, porn, stripping, and BDSM.
Through honest, in-depth conversations, we elevate voices often ignored and silenced.
Together, we're challenging stereotypes and dismantling myths.
We envision a healthier, safer society, especially for women and girls.
We appreciate your company on this journey.
Hi everyone, today you're going to hear Andrea Heinz read out her essay called A Mule for the Patriarchy. It was peer-reviewed by Sandra Norak, who was a survivor and member of Sisters e.V. in Germany, and it was also peer-reviewed by German trauma therapist Dr. Ingeborg Kraus. This paper was first published in 2020, which was about 6 months after Andrea went public with her experience in the prostitution system. It was published by Dignity Journal, which is a journal of analysis of exploitation and violence. The editor-in-chief of Dignity is Dr. Donna Hughes. Andrea received editorial assistance from Kathy King, who is a bereaved mother from Canada who lost her only daughter to sexual exploitation in 1997. Kathy King and Andrea Heinz co-authored the book When Men Buy Sex, Who Really Pays?, which was published in 2024. Today's essay is called A Mule for the Patriarchy, and it has had so much response from the public. It's one of her most popular works to date because it leaves people with a lot of questions, ideas, and thoughts, and for some people it's left them feeling heard for the very first time. It's an exploration of the possibility of the responsibility that women who have been exploited in prostitution have towards the wives and girlfriends of the men who pay to abuse. And it's not blaming. That's really important to understand, but rather it's an exploration of exploitation, of where does responsibility begin and end, and who does it lie with, and does any of it lie with an exploited person themselves. Andrea said this was the most effortless paper she ever wrote, and she said that it seemed almost to write itself. And it's the one that most people mention to her as being most impactful for them, and it helped them see prostitution in a new way, giving them a new understanding of the impact it has on people outside of just the women in prostitution themselves. It's a very powerful work, and you'll get to hear it in her own voice. Thanks.
I was 22 when I first entered the sex trade in Canada. At the time, I had many racing thoughts. Will I end up being hurt or killed? Will I make a lot of money? Will my friends and family find out? My limited exposure to the sex industry growing up meant everything about the activity was unknown. I ran through every possible scenario in my mind of how things could go bad, as well as the possible benefits. I weighed the risks and rewards, ultimately realizing the futility of doing so. I was $60,000 in debt, which all but guaranteed my decision to participate. At no point did I ever consider another woman. I only thought of the buyer and myself. It wasn't long before the first man mentioned his wife. He was a middle-aged jeweler. He boasted about how he and his friend used a collective cover story to get away from their nagging wives in order to frequent the studios once a week. What he said didn't affect me at that time. I had been selling sex for only about 2 weeks, and I was relieved to be making money. Over the course of the year that I saw this man, he always laughed to me about his secret hobby. The arrangement between us ended abruptly, however, after he sexually assaulted me in the back room of his jewelry store. There were countless buyers who would remove their wedding ring. Those men annoyed me right from the start. Not because they were adulterers, but because they somehow thought that by removing their wedding band, they were offering a sign of respect to their wife or to me. Perhaps it helped to dull their guilt about paying a stranger for sex. I recall discussions about this with other women in between sessions, how the men were oblivious to their tan lines or ring indentations that informed us of their marital status regardless. We laughed about how they thought we cared whether they were married or not. Their money was all that mattered. I never once asked a man if he was in a committed relationship, although many would readily offer that information themselves. Some would say, I should probably stop doing this because I'm married. But the majority of disclosers would tell me just so they could offload their frustration about their wives. They particularly seemed to complain about what they deemed to be shortcomings in physical appearance and sexual performance. I disliked the men who talked down about their partners, but would reassure the guilt-filled buyers that, as long as they still loved their wife, they were doing nothing wrong. I'd tell them that meeting their personal needs was warranted if it helped them to be a happy, loving husband. At the time, I believed the remorseful buyers who deceived their partners were somehow more respectable than the arrogant ones. The girlfriends and wives of the men were always in the background. Many of their smiling faces stared at me from family photos placed on nightstands and dressers in their bedrooms while I had sex in their bed. The odd man would turn the frame around to face a wall. Sometimes the men would have their cell phones ring in the middle of the session. They would either ignore the call or they would answer it right then, often motioning for the sex acts to continue while they talked to their partner. Performing fellatio on a married father while he spoke to his wife on the phone was the first time that I ever felt guilty about selling sex. She continued their conversation, unaware her husband was at a brothel, and sounded so kind and loving when she said, "Hurry home, sweetheart." I sat in stunned silence for a moment after that man left, wondering how or if their family unit had suffered so that I could receive $300. I kept hearing his wife's friendly voice. Sometimes the studio phone would ring, and a woman on the other end would ask, "What kind of massage do you offer there?" Perhaps they were investigating a suspicious number found in their husband's call log. We always told them it was a brothel, unaware if it was a call inquiring about employment. One owner in particular delighted in such calls, saying that cheating could lead to resentment, divorce, and poverty, which gave her a great way to acquire new talent. A woman I knew had in fact entered the sex trade after discovering her spouse of over 20 years was a sex buyer. She called it compensated revenge. One evening at the studio, the door chimed, and an unknown female appeared on the camera. She looked uncomfortable. I assumed she had mistaken the business for a registered massage therapy clinic, which sometimes happened. When I greeted her, she pulled out a family photo of her, a man, and their young children, asking if I had ever seen her husband visit the studio. She said she noticed thousands of dollars had been withdrawn from their savings account, always in $300 increments. In addition, she had discovered his online searches for escorts and concluded that he was buying sex. I didn't recognize him. Even if I had, outing a buyer would have meant career suicide, something I wasn't willing to risk for any random woman. She left to go to the next studio, desperate for some answers. Then there was Scott, or so he said, a client I had seen a few times previously. It had been a while, and I said, "Hey, long time no see." He showed me his ringed finger and announced, "Yes, I got married." I gave the customary congratulations, but then I asked, "What are you doing here then? Isn't this the newlywed phase?" He smiled and said, "No complaints with her. The sex is great. She doesn't know I do this. But it's okay. It's not technically cheating if it's sex work." I interpreted that to mean I was an object with whom he was initiating sex, not a living, breathing person with a name. I was not a real woman. I didn't count. Enduring his touching immediately after was an extremely difficult challenge. I felt objectified and used. It was the first time I truly felt like I had been purchased. I'm not sure if it was one of those final instances or an accumulation of them all, but something changed at that point. Until then, I had only ever viewed my actions through a narrow lens. Trading sex had been something that, to me, only ever involved the buyer and myself. Girlfriends, wives, and co-parenting exes were affected by that transaction too. But I never stopped considering my own interests long enough to realize that connection. Many women and families bore the sacrifices for my gains, yet my industry peers would constantly say, "Well, if it's not you, then it's another woman." And, "You're not married to his wife," as if that would somehow reduce or eliminate my feelings of culpability. Perhaps they just knew that it made no difference whether we were the wife or the whore. Neither of us ultimately garnered respect. Not only did I begin experiencing strong other woman guilt, I also began to understand how selling sex was reducing me, reducing all women, to nothing more than a purchasable commodity for men. I had felt moments of empowerment in the past, but could no longer retrieve those feelings. Any mentioning of a girlfriend or wife would cause me to experience overwhelming sadness and guilt. I secretly hoped every one of those women would somehow catch their husbands cheating and find themselves a trustworthy, genuine partner instead. Our decisions are rarely void of a ripple effect, and suddenly I began to see the harmful impact that my part in the industry caused. I was acting as a mule for the patriarchy by championing and perpetuating the objectification of women, the exploitation of our sexuality, and the distortion of consent. I felt I was betraying women and going against the efforts of those who fight hard every day for our authentic equality. Although survival sex had been my entry into the industry, I was one of the lucky ones who eventually became financially stable and autonomous. I could no longer justify my continued participation in something so brutally destructive to women. It is very challenging to discuss the role of the sex seller in the perpetuation of harm without appearing to be victim-blaming. It is important to note that the sex trade, patriarchal system, only exists because of the demand for paid sex services by almost exclusively men, and that the vast majority of sellers and victims are female. It is undoubtedly a system of one sex dominating and exploiting the other, a practice of which women are not responsible for causing. However, within the subculture of sex sellers, there are varying degrees of consciousness to the harm that the sex industry brings to other women. Based upon my personal interactions with hundreds of sex sellers over the past 15 years, I believe there to be 3 levels to the consciousness had by those who sell sex: unaware, mildly aware, and aware. The unaware sex seller is, as the name implies, completely unaware of the negative impact of the sex trade on other women. Perhaps she is new to the industry and has not yet experienced a buyer mention his partner, or she has never had the thought of another woman come into her mind at any given time. I believe most sex sellers initially begin in a state of being unaware. In contrast, the mildly aware sex seller has heard a buyer mention his girlfriend or wife, but has not reached a full realization of the connection between her participation and the harm experienced by the man's companion. There may be certain reasons for the lack of internalization, including, but not limited, to poverty, prior abuse, numbness, and/or substance abuse. Poverty appears to place many women into a state of active denial, and I believe that was certainly the case for me personally. If one is aware that they have no choice but to participate in the sex trade, they will attempt to rationalize and justify their situation as a means of self-preservation. Prior abuse might also lead some sellers to not be fully aware of the harm. They may have experienced deception and betrayal within their personal lives and have come to expect such behaviors within interactions, seeing them as normal. For some women in the sex trade, the disconnect might be a result of the numbness that ensues when one is repeatedly dissociating. Dissociation can have the effect of creating a constant state of emotional detachment whereby the seller numbs out. If there is usage of drugs and/or alcohol as a coping mechanism or due to an addiction, there is removal from the present moment which can restrict the woman from reaching the point of full awareness. The final type, the aware sex seller, has not only experienced the existence or mentioning of a buyer's partner, but has fully internalized the connection between her sex trade involvement and the impact upon other women. Those who are aware either assign moral weight to the realization, with resulting concern about the harm, or they do not. If women assign a moral weight to their awareness of the impact, there is a risk that their continued participation will cause them to experience a sense of injustice, grief, and guilt, just as I did. These women appear likely to seek exit when they are financially stable and where a successful transition out of the industry is possible. Since leaving the sex trade, I've gained deeper clarity about not only my personal actions, but also the bigger picture of what endorsing the mass commercialization of sexual access does to women. With the blinding effect of the money no longer having an impact on me, I have grown increasingly remorseful for how I could have ever had any part in the sex industry at all, especially as an owner of a brothel myself. My personal work titled On Exiting from Commercial Sexual Exploitation, Insights from Sex Trade Experienced Persons, speaks to what I call the tipping point, whereby certain sex sellers arrive at a place where they no longer derive any positive feelings from their involvement, and instead begin to view their participation in a newly negative light. Although the harm I have caused can never be undone, I feel compelled to do all I can to expose and denounce what I believe to be one of the greatest human rights violations in existence: sexual exploitation. To the women I employed at my brothel, I am so sorry. To all the girlfriends and wives of the men with whom I had sex, and all the women in family units with men from whom I took family unit funds, I am so sorry. To the women I impacted culturally by saying sex work is work, I am so sorry. It is the ultimate injury to say sex work is work. It undermines our collective regard for one another as women, as sisters, in preserving our personal dignity and genuine sexual integrity. Work is traditionally payment for labor or activity, a voluntary exchange of service for wages. To refer to capitalized sex, rooted in socioeconomic marginalization, as work, is to normalize and legitimize women's sex-based oppression. Such wording implies a mutually agreeable and equitable exchange, the very antithesis of what selling sex entails. In addition, the phrase sex work is work serves to silence anyone who challenges the dominant narrative of universal empowerment and willful choice had by sex sellers. For many who are active in the trade, both buyers and sellers, it is said in an effort to rationalize and justify their participation. However, such declarations provide a great disservice to women when we become hypersexualized and exploited through the many sublets of the adult industry. This language creates a powerful normative effect that is devastating on both an individual and social level. Ingeborg Kraus calls the wives and partners of sex buyers shadow women. She describes the impact of the sex trade on the women outside the sex industry in her work titled Shadow Women, Wives Betrayed by Sex Buyers, saying, "There has been nearly no consideration paid to this collateral damage, and there are very few reports about it." She adds that victims aren't taken seriously and don't receive effective help. Within her conscious raising paper, Kraus shares the insights of a woman who was married to a man who purchased sex. Much of what this woman shared in Kraus's paper aligns with what I have witnessed, and it resonated deeply within me. Kraus quotes a wife who got to know women whose husbands had engaged in sex buying until they lost control and amassed high debts. Without their wives knowing, they had ruined the whole family. I still see the woman at the studio door holding the family photo, trying to make sense of it all and where the family savings had gone. The wife in the Kraus interview expresses her belief that the social conscience is obvious. The woman is shamed, If a man goes to buy sex, it is because the wife isn't sexy or good enough in bed. I think of the countless men that took pleasure in wife bashing to me. Krauss describes how men forget their wives and children when they are visiting women in the sex trade. Many sex sellers like myself can surely attest to the buyers who remove their wedding rings and somehow neatly compartmentalize aspects of their lives separate from one another. What personally struck me the most poignantly, though, was how the wife of the sex buyer summarized the impact on her directly. She says, "It was a horrible wake-up moment when it was revealed. It was a torturing and traumatizing time. I wanted to know the truth about my life. The life I thought of as my own didn't exist." It hurts me to think of how many women I may have caused to share similar sentiments. In an additional paper written by Krauss in 2019 titled "Betrayed Partners and Men with Poisoned Souls: Interview with a Former Sex Buyer in Germany," she states that what the buyers are doing to their wives is an incredible harm, causing huge mental health damages, adding that, given the fact that there are a great number of married men or those in a firm relationship who buy sexual services, the number of psychologically injured women in these relationships probably reaches the 2-digit millions. When sex sellers, as part of their learned and prescribed role, gleefully pander to men's desires for sexual access on demand, men's general perceptions of women change. Misogynistic and sexist views of women are reinforced, and suddenly all women are considered procurable pawns. Some women become worthy of payment for their sexual availability, and others not. For many of the latter, who have already experienced betrayal, loss of otherwise joint money. For many of the latter, like the partners at home who already experienced betrayal, loss of otherwise joint money may be an added insult. There were multiple times that I witnessed the aware sex seller state things such as, "I don't give a shit about his wife," and "his relationship is not my problem." Although the sex trade victimizes all women as an oppressive system, is there no responsibility whatsoever to be had by those who knowingly and purposely step on other women so callously when other viable income opportunities exist? It is both an uncomfortable and unpopular consideration to pose, given the fact that the sex trade is a man-made culture in which women undeservingly bear, and have historically bore, the brunt of shame and repercussions. Nonetheless, I feel it is a valid question. I have many regrets from my time in the sex trade, but none so many or severe as the damage I, directly and indirectly, caused to my fellow women. Sexual access is an intimacy I believe is best earned through trust, respect, and mutuality. Such ideals surely support equality between the sexes far better than monetary coercion. Women who choose to sell sex among other viable options might benefit, as I did, in taking time to stop and truly question what they are doing, accept personal responsibility for the harm in which they are involved, and build compassion for their fellow women. Women as a group deserve solidarity given our continuous worldwide struggles with male violence and patriarchy. When circumvented consent becomes sanitized as work, it negates the harm done to all the women involved, the sex sellers themselves, the buyer's partner, and women as a whole. If it is a job like any other, men are merely accessing a service, not cheating other relationships, and in turn, women become a product like any other, objectified and dehumanized. As with other capitalist exchanges, there exists a constant struggle between supply and demand. Sex sellers want to provide the least amount of service for the most money possible. Sex buyers want the most amount of service for the lowest degree of expenditure. The tension of pushing and defending boundaries is what defines and determines the sexual transaction. Conceding is not consent. Those of us who have endured commercial sexual exploitation and defected from sex work ideology are often snubbed and or severely berated by women who are still active in the industry. We are accused of being anti-woman and anti-choice, as detractors of women's bodily autonomy. We are accused of hampering the pursuit of female empowerment and financial independence. Our insights and opinions on equality, dignity, and respect are not welcomed nor supported by those who are still actively participating. Labeled as SWERFs, sex worker exclusionary radical feminists, abolitionist-minded women become the problem, not the sex buyers nor their actions. The sex trade drives a massive wedge in between women and our collective unity, further entrenching our subjugation by men. Women who understand and navigate patriarchal systems have the option of challenging the systems that constrain them. It is long overdue that we as women prioritize each other when faced with the choice of ignoring or dismissing our shared presence. My personal opinion is that genuine feminism holds all women in high regard as we stand united in dignity and equality, our sexual integrity not for sale. As long as we remain divided by price or availability, we are universally disposable. We all deserve mutually respectful relationships with each other and men alike in a world of social, economic, and political equality.
When I first listened to this essay, the very first thing I thought of was when we had what we called at the time bad punters. And I would now put bad punters in inverted commas because, they're all bad when you think about what they're doing. They're paying to access the body of somebody who is completely uninterested in them. So what I mean by bad is beyond the premise that they're paying, beyond the fact that they know they're with somebody who doesn't want them. It's when they do things that cross boundaries. They're difficult. They may try and do things they shouldn't. It's beyond what has been agreed upon for that money, or they try to slip off condoms and things like that. But the point isn't what they did. The point is what we did. And it was a very common phenomena in New Zealand. The common phenomena of how to deal with a bad dude when you've been sent to his place, an out call. That's what we call it in New Zealand. Sent like a pizza delivery to the dude's home or a hotel room. But specifically when in his home, you'd walk in and after doing all of the safety checks, and safety checks are a big deal, you'd also you'd leave markers. You'd indicate that you'd been there to his wife, his girlfriend. You'd see the photos on the wall, so you knew there was one, or on the bedside table. And the best way to do it was to see which side of the bed he jumped in, because that showed you which side of the bed was hers. That's where you'd be. So you get out your lipstick and you mark the sheet on her side where he won't see it. Or you throw a tampon under the bed, just slightly under. You know he's not going to be vacuuming under there or cleaning up so thoroughly that he checks under the bed. She'll find it and she'll know. Or maybe you leave a mark on the hand towel in the bathroom. There's many ways that we would leave these little telltale signs. But the point was for her to find it. And it's a message. The message is run, get out. The man you married or the man that you're thinking of marrying is no good. Because we know, even back then we knew, that what he was prepared to do to a woman he didn't know in prostitution was what he would eventually be prepared to do to his wife given enough time. And that's the only real difference. It's the time. He may practice on a stranger that he pays before he ramps it up and ramps it up and ramps it up and eventually does the exact same thing to the woman he claims to love. So I suppose my message is to the women who they got those indicators. You're not crazy. You didn't make it up. She probably did it on purpose. And yes, it was a message to run. And if that's what you did and he moved on, as many of them do, and he's married again now with a new wife and she's meant to be the younger, prettier, better version of you, and she's meant to be getting all the things that he never gave you, I promise you there's a woman marking the bedsheet, throwing a tampon under the bed, leaving a towel on the floor, dropping a hand towel, leaving a tiny bit of lipstick on the mirror, doing something to let her know. Run, and you're not missing a damn thing. You got out, good for you. It made me think of something else as well, and that's some of the writings that I'd heard years and years and years earlier. Because you see, people have been talking about prostitution since the dawn of time. Well, maybe not that early, but you know what I mean. The first quote, Saint Augustine of Hippo, circa 430 Anno Domini, so 430 Christian era. Remove harlots from human affairs and you will unsettle everything because of lusts. From Diodine, arguing for the need to tolerate the evil to prevent a greater one. It's the argument that men must have women to pay, and that if they don't, society will crumble and there'll be a great evil. This has been a setup for women, the wives and the girlfriends, to hate the necessary evil, to tolerate the woman in prostitution who is perceived as bad, wrong, evil. Rather than to question him, it is to take all responsibility off the man and onto women's shoulders. This setup's been going for a long, long time. I wish I could say that that was the earliest known quote, but actually not even close. The earliest one that I was able to find was in Athens in 638 to 558 BC. There was an author, Solon, Solon, for those who wish to look it up, and he writes, inverted commas, I established brothels furnished with handsome women in various parts of the city for the service of the youth. And he was referring to state-run brothels. And the justification for these was that men would cheat on good women if they didn't have bad women to use. And it was legal. State-run meaning legal. And it wasn't the only one going closer to our time, but still over 2,000 years ago. Demosthenes? I think it's Demosthenes is how it's said. So I'll say it that way, and if it's wrong, too bad. Demosthenes, orator 384 to 322 BC. Quote, we have courtesans for pleasure, concubines for daily service, and wives for bearing legitimate children and as faithful guardians of our homes. In this quote, they're literally talking about how women are useful to them. And in this quote, the women are not citizens, they're useful service animals for men. The courtesans are the higher paid. They're the ones who were there for the royals, for royalty, for those of high breeding. So they hung out in the courts. They often only saw one or two men. Concubines for daily service. They were the women who were treated appallingly and usually died in the places where they worked. And they were given very little coin, and most of it was taken, and a lot of them were often born into it or sold into it. And then they say wives for bearing legitimate children and as faithful guardians of the homes, meaning here's the woman who breeds for you and cleans up after you. Nothing in that is about love. Nothing in that is about respect. And you can also see that the three situations are set up to hate one another and to perceive each other as the enemy rather than the ones doing that to them. And that is again Grecian. But Rome was not all that wonderful to women either. In Infamia, circa 18 BC, or infamia, I'm not sure how that's said, but it's Roman law. It said the act of registration was an automatic self-designation of infamia, legally marking the woman as a person of low status and thereby immunizing the client from the crime of adultery. And that's a summary of the law's effect. So what they're saying is that she's not a real person. She's so low that he is not committing adultery so long as it's with her. Again, set up for wives and girlfriends to hate her because he's allowed to be with her without it being adultery, and set up for her to hate the women that are the wives and girlfriends because of the low status. So men set up this system, and they have worked very, very hard to make women perceive other women as the enemy, and so that women are fighting each other to this day about the legal structures, about the understanding of status within it, whether it is empowering or not empowering to women. It isn't, let's be clear. Women are arguing about not just the legal status, but what legalities should be and shouldn't be, and men are sitting back as though they didn't create it. They're using women as shields. So we have the red umbrellas who are all for the full decriminalization, which includes pimps and punters. And then the pimps and the punters are hiding behind those women who are fighting on their behalf, which is sad. And we've got wives and girlfriends thinking that this whore, and I'm using that word purposely, is laughing all the way to the bank, when in reality she's barely getting enough to make it worth her while at all. And there is no savings, and there's no house, and there's no ownership of anything. And when it ends, she will be worse for wear because she'll have nothing on her CV and have to work somewhere. And it'll be starting out like she's 18, 19, 20 years old, yet she may be 40 by the time that happens. We have to get over this idea that we're on opposite sides fighting each other and start actually looking at how men set this up so that they would not be blamed, but women would be blamed instead. No, the girlfriend, the wife did not do bad in the bedroom or not care to his needs. It's not that she is lacking empathy, sympathy. And no, the woman who's getting paid is not laughing all the way to the bank. She's barely getting by. And she's doing this out of a lack of options, not out of multiple great, fantastic, awesome options, and that she just happens to be really, really feeling like having sex, a lot of it. That's not the way this goes down. And we are on the same side. The woman who marks the bed to let you know is on your side. Thanks.
We hope you found this episode informative. To follow us on social media, click the links in the show notes below. If there is a topic you would like us to cover, you can contact us at redlightexposé.podcast@gmail.com or head on over to our website, redlightexposé.com. There you can also find a donation page if you'd like to support the show. All the hosts at Red Light Exposé are volunteers, so we rely on your donations to continue to compensate our survivor guests and cover operative costs. Thank you for listening. We hope you tune in next time.